Episode 2, The Silence of Allies. The shock of betrayal still burned across the systems of the Terran Accord. The Elythians, once revered as guardians of peace, had struck without warning, leaving in their wake burning colonies, shattered orbital habitats, and millions of lives extinguished in a matter of weeks. Humanity had survived the first onslaught, but survival alone was insufficient. The Terran Accord now faced a realization that was almost more harrowing than the destruction itself. They were utterly alone. Across the galaxy, messages of desperation were sent to every civilization that had once been an ally or beneficiary of Terran diplomacy. Envoys of humanity, whose words had once forged treaties and averted wars, now spoke into silence. Pleas for aid, for intervention, for mediation traversed the void at the speed of light, reaching the Vaori clusters, the Kalith strongholds, and the Uran Confederacy, among dozens of smaller civilizations whose histories had been intertwined with Earth for centuries. The responses were measured, cautious, and ultimately hollow. The Vaori, whose fleets had once cooperated with Terran explorers to settle distant asteroid belts, declared neutrality. Their council stated that the Elythians' wrath was not a conflict they could intervene in without risking annihilation. The Kalith, once proud warriors whose honor had been tempered by centuries of Terran arbitration, responded with fear and calculation. Any interference would invite immediate destruction. The Uran Confederacy offered condolences, formal and polite, but no tangible support. One by one, every civilization that humanity had once counted upon chose silence over solidarity. This silence was more than disappointment. It was a mirror reflecting the fragility of trust in the galaxy. The Terran Accord, whose diplomacy had been the foundation of interstellar peace, had overestimated the permanence of alliances. It was a brutal lesson. Survival depended not on the ideals of cooperation or the moral weight of history, but on power, readiness, and the capacity for sacrifice. Humanity's reaction was both swift and agonizing. The Terran Council convened, their chambers no longer spaces of measured debate, but crucibles of urgent decision. The archives and records of peaceful governance, once treasured, were now analyzed for military strategy. Scientists and engineers, previously devoted to exploration and innovation, were summoned to design defenses, weapons, and vessels capable of resisting the Elythians. The economy, once flourishing on trade, culture, and leisure, was reoriented towards survival. Every resource, every laborer, and every thought was refocused on the singular goal of defending the remnants of the Accord. The colonies themselves became the first arenas of transformation. Mars, scarred by the initial attacks, was rebuilt as a fortress world. Its cities, once centers of research and agriculture, were layered with defensive structures, orbital turrets, and rapid response evacuation facilities. Europa's icy seas, once laboratories of exploration, were converted into hidden shipyards and underground depots. Titan's shattered rings were cleared and reconstructed as platforms for surveillance, interception, and training. Even the smaller settlements, previously considered peripheral, were armed, fortified, and networked into a planetary defense grid. Humanity's reach across the solar system became not a network of peace and prosperity, but a lattice of survival and preparedness. Meanwhile, the Terran Council engaged in a meticulous study of the Elythian attack patterns. The crystalline fleets, with their geometry and energy weapons, were unlike anything humanity had encountered. Intelligence and observation became as critical as firepower. Every battle, even those lost, provided insights into Elythian tactics, strengths, and vulnerabilities. Humanity learned to anticipate, adapt, and endure. This was a civilization-level education in war, rapid, unforgiving, and universal. As months turned into cycles, the psychological impact of isolation became apparent. Across Earth and the colonies, citizens confronted a reality that had been previously unthinkable. The galaxy, vast and populous, would not intervene on their behalf. The civilizations that had once benefited from Terran mediation had abandoned them, motivated by fear, calculation, or indifference. The notion of universal justice was revealed as a fragile illusion. Humanity was alone, and it would remain so unless it proved capable of defending itself. In response, philosophy itself was transformed. The doctrines of peace, once sacrosanct, were reinterpreted through the lens of survival. Schools of thought emerged that preached resilience over idealism, strategy over morality, and collective duty over individual aspiration. Ethical debates, once devoted to questions of art and diplomacy, now revolved around the limits of violence, the calculus of defense, and the obligations of citizens in a civilization under existential threat. The Terran Accord's ideology evolved not through gradual reflection, but through necessity imposed by betrayal. The first countermeasures began in scattered skirmishes. Converted freighters, mining vessels, and abandoned stations became makeshift fleets, launching probes and ambushes against Elythian scouting ships. The victories were small, often Pyrrhic, but each was a lesson in adaptation. Humanity discovered that the Elythians, while formidable, were not invincible. The crystalline vessels required coordination, and their energy weapons, while devastating, were susceptible to interference and misdirection. Every encounter taught humanity more about the enemy, building knowledge into experience, and experience into doctrine. Across the colonies, civilians became soldiers, engineers became tacticians, and philosophers became strategists. Culture itself was repurposed for survival. Art became propaganda for morale, music became cadence for training, and architecture was designed with both aesthetic and defensive purposes in mind. The transformation was total, affecting every aspect of human life. Civilization itself was a living organism being reshaped under the pressure of war. Despite the overwhelming odds, humanity began to develop resilience. Networks of communication and coordination improved, and small victories created a sense of shared purpose. Colonies that had once been isolated now formed interdependent defense systems. Supply chains, once designed for commerce, were optimized for rapid delivery of materials to front lines. Information became a weapon, with intelligence networks tracking Elythian movements, analyzing patterns, and predicting attacks before they came. The Elythians, for their part, continued their campaign with clinical precision, unaware that their aggression was producing a more dangerous adversary. The Terran Accord, while battered and isolated, was learning. It was learning to endure, to anticipate, to fight, and ultimately to survive. Humanity's transformation was slow, painful, and universal, touching every colony, every settlement, every mind. By the end of the first year of conflict, the Terran Accord had become a civilization on the cusp of rebirth. Its fleets, though small and improvised, were coordinated. Its colonies, though scarred, were fortified. Its people, though grieving, were resolved. And though the Elythians remained the greatest threat in the galaxy, humanity had begun to discover a truth long forgotten. The survival of a civilization depended not on allies, but on its own capacity to endure, adapt, and overcome. The silence of allies, once a despairing void, had become a crucible. Humanity was alone, yet in that aloneness, it found clarity. The Terran Accord would survive, not because of treaties or galactic favor, but because it would learn to fight as one, as a civilization united not only by peace, but now by the fire of necessity. In the cold and vast darkness of space, where the Elythians' fleets glimmered like shards of ice, humanity prepared. They were no longer a civilization defined by ideals alone, but by resilience, strategy, and the will to endure. The next stage of the conflict would test them in ways the galaxy had never seen. And from the silence of the stars, a new, hardened Terran Accord began to emerge, ready to meet betrayal with strength and isolation with defiance. Humanity's adaptation was both rapid and profound, no longer sheltered by the illusions of permanent peace. The Terran Accord harnessed every resource, every mind, and every scrap of knowledge toward the singular goal of survival. The archives of past conflicts, once dusty tomes and historical curiosities, were revived as guides. Military tactics, fleet formations, and strategic doctrines from Earth's long-forgotten wars were studied, adapted, and expanded into frameworks for interstellar conflict. Engineers who had spent decades perfecting civilian transport ships now redesigned them into fast, maneuverable warcraft, reinforced and armed to the limit of material science. Shipyards that once specialized in luxury liners now produced fleets of modular vessels capable of rapid reconfiguration, each one a testament to human ingenuity pressed under necessity. Across the colonies, the people transformed alongside their technology. Communities once devoted to leisure and culture now embraced collective training and readiness. Agricultural hubs doubled as supply depots. Laboratories became research centers for weapons and energy projection, and schools became recruitment and training grounds. Every citizen, regardless of profession or prior expertise, became part of a civilization-wide mobilization. Philosophy itself shifted. Ethical debates on diplomacy and coexistence gave way to discussions of risk, probability, and sacrifice. For the first time in generations, humanity's survival was a matter of shared, organized strategy rather than trust in allies or the natural order of peace. The Elythians, observing from their crystalline vessels, maintained their methodical assault. They advanced with surgical precision, striking at planetary systems, orbital stations, and trade hubs in patterns that suggested a deep understanding of Terran behavior. Yet every engagement revealed new insights. Early skirmishes taught humanity the value of unpredictability and deception. Mining ships, retrofitted with energy shields and projectile weapons, were dispatched as decoys, drawing the enemy into ambushes crafted from knowledge of gravitational fields, orbital mechanics, and improvised countermeasures. Even failures provided critical intelligence. The loss of a single colony could illuminate the vulnerabilities of an Elythian cruiser, the limitations of their energy projection, or the delay inherent in their formation shifts. Humanity's counteroffensives began cautiously, first probing, then escalating. In the asteroid belts beyond Mars, converted freighters and mining vessels engaged Elythian scouts in hit-and-run operations, testing defenses and mapping their formations. The first victories were small: a disabled cruiser here, a partially damaged frigate there, but the significance was profound. For the first time, the Terran Accord proved that the Elythians could be resisted, that their technology, formidable as it was, had exploitable weaknesses. Every success became a lesson, every failure a blueprint for improvement. The societal restructuring that underpinned these military actions was unprecedented. Governance shifted from councils focused on legislation and cultural stewardship to a centralized command prioritizing efficiency, coordination, and rapid decision-making. Cities became nodes in a planetary defense network, connected through encrypted communication channels that could survive the interference of Elythian energy projections. Supply chains were redesigned for speed and resilience, ensuring that food, materials, and ammunition could flow uninterrupted to the front lines. Economic models, once designed for trade and comfort, were refashioned to maximize production, prioritizing materials critical for defense over luxury or leisure. The Terran Accord, in essence, had re-engineered civilization itself as a single, coherent instrument of survival. Throughout this period, the silence of the galaxy remained absolute. Civilizations that had once relied upon Terran diplomacy now offered only observation, and in some cases, subtle warning to avoid interference. The Terran Accord came to understand the harsh reality. In the eyes of the galaxy, survival was the responsibility of the individual civilization, not of collective moral obligation. Humanity was alone, and the only guarantees were the decisions made within its own borders. This realization, though bitter, forged a clarity of purpose previously unknown. Every action, every deployment, every strategy was honed with the understanding that no rescue would come from the stars. Despite the enormous pressure, small triumphs began to accumulate. A fleet of retrofitted freighters, coordinated across hundreds of kilometers of asteroid field, successfully ambushed an Elythian supply convoy, capturing critical materials for human adaptation. Observation posts constructed in remote regions of the solar system detected energy signatures indicative of Elythian formation weaknesses, enabling preemptive adjustments in fleet deployment. Orbital habitats, once civilian hubs, now hosted command centers with integrated communications, sensors, and defensive emplacements, turning the skies of Earth into a battlefield the enemy could not navigate unchallenged. Humanity's adaptation extended beyond technology and infrastructure. Morale, once fragile in the face of overwhelming odds, was cultivated deliberately as a resource. Cultural practices, once designed for celebration and leisure, were repurposed for unity, discipline, and resilience. Music and art became instruments for psychological endurance. Literature, historical chronicles, and philosophy were reframed to inspire courage, patience, and strategic thinking. Every cultural artifact was weaponized for survival, reinforcing a collective identity capable of enduring not only physical attacks, but also the isolation imposed by the silence of allies. By the second cycle of conflict, humanity had begun to demonstrate the true potential of civilization-level coordination. Coordinated strikes disrupted Elythian reconnaissance in the outer belts, while fortified colonies in the inner system absorbed repeated bombardments with minimal casualties. Lessons learned from one system were rapidly implemented across all colonies, creating a dynamic network of adaptation that allowed humanity to evolve at a speed unmatched by any single battlefield encounter. The Terran Accord, though battered, was no longer the passive target it had been during the first months of war. It had begun to fight as a civilization, not merely as scattered survivors. The Elythians, despite their overwhelming power, began to confront a new reality. Humanity's capacity to learn, adapt, and endure was formidable. Their crystalline fleets, designed to subdue and annihilate, encountered resistance that was neither expected nor fully understood. The patterns of Terran strategy evolved faster than the Elythians could predict, integrating new tactics, technologies, and decentralized decision-making. Each engagement, rather than simply demonstrating the futility of resistance, revealed the emergence of a civilization capable of transformation under extreme pressure. The year drew to a close with humanity still standing, though deeply scarred. The colonies bore the marks of attack, and countless lives had been lost. Yet the Terran Accord had changed fundamentally. No longer the utopia of ideals alone, it had become a civilization forged in the crucible of betrayal, capable of mobilizing its population, resources, and knowledge in ways that made survival plausible. In the silence of the galaxy, in the absence of allies, humanity had discovered that its greatest strength lay not in treaties or diplomacy, but in its capacity to endure, learn, and act as one coherent force. And in this silence, the Terran Accord made a silent vow. They would survive, they would adapt, they would endure. And when the Elythians struck again, they would be met not by a civilization of dreamers, but by a civilization reborn in the fire of betrayal, united by purpose and tempered by necessity. The galaxy may have turned its back, but humanity had begun its long journey towards strength. And in that journey, no star would remain untouched by the shadow of a civilization determined to survive. The early battles across the outer colonies became laboratories of adaptation. Each engagement, whether in the icy depths of Europa or the asteroid belts of the Kuiper region, produced lessons that were rapidly assimilated across the Terran Accord. Mining ships retrofitted with energy dispersal shields were tested against Elythian beam weapons, revealing patterns in their attack timing that allowed human fleets to dodge or minimize damage. Freighters armed with automated turrets, once considered impossibly slow for combat, became mobile artillery platforms, delivering concentrated strikes against Elythian vessels while retreating under coordinated counterfire. Every defeat, every ship lost, contributed to a cumulative intelligence that began to rival the analytical capacity of Elythian command networks. Humanity's technological adaptations accelerated with extraordinary speed. Research stations, previously dedicated to scientific exploration, became innovation hubs. Engineers developed energy diffusers capable of bending Elythian beams, creating temporary shadows that allowed convoys to pass through dangerous zones unscathed. Orbital habitats were equipped with electromagnetic scramblers, disrupting enemy targeting systems just long enough to save lives. Even terraforming machinery, designed to shape planetary atmospheres, was converted into mobile defensive platforms, capable of launching orbital countermeasures or deploying rapid deployment fortifications. Each innovation reflected a civilization learning in real time, improvising on a scale unprecedented in its history. Simultaneously, humanity's strategic thinking evolved. The Terran Council began to deploy decentralized command networks, allowing colonies to act autonomously while remaining coordinated within the broader system. Decisions that once required approval through layers of bureaucracy were now executed at the speed of necessity. Smaller fleets were instructed to engage in diversionary tactics, drawing Elythian attention away from critical installations. Human colonies experimented with feints, ambushes, and misinformation campaigns that leveraged Elythian assumptions of linear behavior. Patterns of attack and defense, once static and predictable, became fluid and adaptive. Humanity was learning not only to survive, but to anticipate the enemy, to manipulate the battlefield, and to exploit weaknesses in an opponent that had never encountered such ingenuity. The human population, too, changed under these conditions. Civilians who had never known hardship became integral to the war effort. Engineers, artists, teachers, and scholars contributed to fleet design, morale, and logistics. Families trained together, forging bonds that reinforced unity and purpose. Education emphasized both skill and resilience, creating a society in which every individual understood the stakes of survival. Culture itself became a tool of endurance. Music, art, and storytelling reinforced courage and discipline, embedding a collective mentality capable of withstanding repeated disaster. In the outer belt, a decisive skirmish demonstrated the potential of this adaptation. A flotilla composed of converted freighters, mining rigs, and research vessels engaged an Elythian scouting fleet. Human commanders, leveraging data gathered from prior encounters, coordinated the attack to exploit gaps in Elythian formation patterns. Energy dispersers, shields, and improvised decoys created confusion among the enemy. The battle was chaotic, with heavy losses on both sides, but the humans prevailed. For the first time, a coordinated strike not only survived, but inflicted measurable damage. The significance was monumental. Humanity had proven that the Elythians were not invulnerable, and that survival was possible through ingenuity, coordination, and sheer determination. This victory was as much philosophical as strategic. Across the Terran Accord, the news ignited hope. It demonstrated that despite isolation and the silence of allies, humanity could take the fight to the Elythians and emerge intact. The Terran Council leveraged this moment to further unify the colonies, establishing new doctrines of training, intelligence sharing, and rapid technological adaptation. Every victory reinforced a culture of resilience, emphasizing that the survival of the species depended on the collective will of the civilization itself, not on the intervention of others. The adaptation of industry paralleled military evolution. Factories once devoted to civilian production were refitted to mass-produce modular weapons platforms, energy shielding systems, and mobile repair units. Resource extraction intensified across Mars, the asteroid belt, and outer colonies, prioritizing materials essential for defense. Even the smallest settlements became nodes in a networked supply chain capable of supporting coordinated fleet actions across hundreds of millions of kilometers. The human economy, once oriented around trade and luxury, became a living mechanism of survival, its efficiency tested and honed in the furnace of necessity. By the second year of conflict, humanity had begun to establish a rhythm of engagement and adaptation. Outlying colonies were transformed into strategic bastions, designed to slow Elythian advances and protect critical industrial infrastructure. Fleet engagements became increasingly sophisticated, incorporating multi-layered defenses, coordinated ambushes, and diversionary tactics. Each encounter, whether a skirmish in the asteroid belts or a defensive action near Jupiter's moons, provided data that was fed into the civilization's growing intelligence apparatus. Humanity was learning to fight not as isolated fleets, but as a single, adaptive organism, capable of absorbing loss, learning from it, and emerging stronger. And yet the psychological weight of isolation persisted. The silence of other civilizations continued to loom over every decision. The Terran Accord recognized that no aid would arrive from allies, no reprieve from the wider galaxy. This reality sharpened the focus of human civilization, but it also imposed a profound ethical burden. Every action, every strategic choice carried consequences for millions of lives. Commanders were not just leaders of fleets, they were stewards of civilization, charged with preserving the future through calculated sacrifice. The philosophical frameworks of humanity shifted accordingly, placing collective survival above individual ambition, pragmatism above idealism, and resilience above comfort. By the third cycle, humanity's capacity for coordinated defense had become formidable. The Terran Accord began to conduct limited offensive operations, striking Elythian reconnaissance nodes, disrupting supply lines, and testing enemy weaknesses. These operations, though limited in scale, demonstrated that humanity could project power beyond its immediate colonies, and that strategic initiative was not solely the domain of the Elythians. Civilization-wide learning had reached a level where tactics were no longer static, but dynamic, adaptive, and anticipatory. The year closed with the Terran Accord transformed. Humanity had endured, adapted, and begun to thrive under pressure. Fleets were organized, colonies fortified, and knowledge of the enemy continuously integrated into strategy. The lessons of isolation had been brutal, but they had produced a civilization capable of facing overwhelming odds. The silence of allies, once a source of despair, had become a crucible in which humanity was forged anew. And as the Elythians regrouped beyond the outer colonies, they would encounter a human civilization no longer naive, no longer vulnerable, but resolute, adaptive, and prepared to endure whatever came next. By the fourth cycle of the conflict, humanity had progressed from tentative skirmishes to coordinated counter-offensives across multiple star systems. The Terran Accord's fleets, once improvised collections of retrofitted freighters and mining vessels, had coalesced into structured formations capable of both defense and limited projection of power. Command networks integrated the experiences of thousands of encounters, creating an adaptive intelligence that allowed commanders to anticipate Elythian tactics. Civilizations that had once relied on static formations now engaged in fluid maneuvers, dispersing and regrouping to exploit enemy weaknesses while minimizing human losses. Colonies became increasingly specialized to support these operations. Outer settlements, previously peripheral, were converted into strategic staging grounds, housing shipyards, ammunition depots, and energy refueling stations. Orbital habitats functioned as defensive fortresses, their walls lined with automated turrets, shield generators, and rapid deployment crews. Industrial centers were integrated into a network of supply and repair, ensuring that each engagement could be sustained without overextension. The economy, social structures, and even culture had been reorganized to serve the demands of survival, transforming humanity into a civilization that operated as a single, coordinated organism. Technological innovation surged under the relentless pressure of conflict. Engineers developed adaptive shielding that could absorb and redirect portions of Elythian energy beams, while freighters, retrofitted with energy projectors, became mobile support platforms capable of augmenting fleet firepower. Autonomous drones, once used for scientific observation, now served as scouts, decoys, and sabotage units. Even the principles of orbital mechanics were weaponized, allowing humanity to manipulate gravitational fields to advantage during engagements. Each innovation reflected not only ingenuity, but a civilization, learning to think in three-dimensional interstellar terms, leveraging both the physical environment and accumulated intelligence to offset technological inferiority. Humanity's counteroffensives grew more audacious. Coordinated raids were conducted across asteroid belts, Jovian moons, and outer colonies, each operation designed to disrupt Elythian reconnaissance, test defensive responses, and seize resources critical for further adaptation. Losses were inevitable. Human fleets were still outmatched in raw firepower, and entire stations and settlements were sacrificed in the pursuit of long-term survival. Yet the strategic benefits of these actions were undeniable. Every operation yielded data that improved defensive systems, enhanced fleet coordination, and refined tactical doctrines. The Terran Accord was no longer reactive. It was beginning to shape the battlefield itself. The societal consequences of this transformation were profound. Civilians, once passive beneficiaries of a utopian order, became active participants in survival. Education, culture, and daily life were integrated with strategic objectives. Children were trained in simulation programs that emphasized spatial awareness, resource management, and coordinated action. Artists and engineers collaborated to design fortifications, camouflage, and morale-boosting projects that reinforced unity. Philosophers debated ethical frameworks suitable for a civilization under existential threat, emphasizing pragmatism, collective responsibility, and the moral imperative of survival. Humanity had become a society in which every individual, every decision, and every resource contributed directly to the survival of the whole. Despite these adaptations, the psychological toll of isolation remained significant. The silence of allies weighed heavily on decision-makers and citizens alike. Messages sent to distant civilizations went unanswered. An observation confirmed that the galaxy, vast and populous, remained indifferent to humanity's plight. Yet this silence, while harrowing, also clarified priorities. Humanity could rely only upon itself, and in that realization, the Terran Accord found focus and coherence. Decisions became more rapid, strategies more unified, and society more resilient. Survival became both the objective and the organizing principle of civilization. The Elythians, for their part, maintained pressure but began to encounter increasing resistance. The adaptive strategies of humanity, the fortification of colonies, and the ingenuity of fleets slowed their advance. Small victories by human forces, while individually limited, began to accumulate strategically. A damaged Elythian scout cruiser here, a disrupted supply convoy there. Each success provided insights and tangible advantages that were leveraged across the system. Humanity's capacity to learn from defeat, to incorporate intelligence into real-time adaptation, began to challenge the assumption of Elythian invincibility. By the fifth cycle, the Terran Accord had achieved a level of operational sophistication that fundamentally altered the nature of the conflict. Decentralized command structures allowed colonies to operate semi-autonomously, responding to local threats while remaining integrated into a system-wide strategy. Fleet formations, once linear and predictable, now engaged in complex maneuvers, using feints, diversions, and multi-directional attacks to confound Elythian forces. Technology and innovation were deployed not as isolated tools, but as coordinated systems, creating defensive and offensive capabilities greater than the sum of their parts. Humanity's success was not limited to survival. It was the emergence of a civilization capable of proactive engagement. The Terran Accord was learning to project power, control the flow of battle, and exploit the weaknesses of an overwhelmingly superior opponent. Culture, education, and philosophy had been repurposed to serve the collective strategy, creating a society in which adaptation, resilience, and coordination were not merely encouraged, but encoded into the structure of civilization itself. As the fifth cycle drew to a close, humanity's position remained precarious. The Elythians were still the dominant force in the galaxy, capable of annihilation on a scale unmatched by human fleets. Yet the Terran Accord had demonstrated an extraordinary truth. Even in isolation, even against a seemingly invincible foe, a civilization could endure, adapt, and prepare to fight back. The silence of the galaxy, once a source of despair, had become a crucible in which humanity had forged its capacity for coordinated survival and strategic initiative. By the end of this period, the Terran Accord was no longer a civilization, defined solely by ideals of peace and cooperation. It had become a civilization forged by necessity, capable of responding to existential threats with unity, ingenuity, and determination. The Elythians had intended to destroy humanity, to crush it under the weight of their power, and to demonstrate the futility of resistance. Instead, they had created a civilization capable of endurance, strategic adaptation, and eventual counteraction. Humanity had become a force shaped not by allies or treaties, but by its own resilience, capable of surviving the isolation and indifference of the galaxy itself.